Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a topic that, well, it really asks us to look beyond the standard stories we often hear about a country's history and its global role.
Exactly. We're looking at the history and nature of what quite a few of our sources describe as American imperialism and global dominance.
And how that whole concept, at least as presented here, seems to have shifted over time. From pushing across the continent to wielding power through, well, economics and other means.
That's the trajectory these sources trace. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a mix. We have some rigorous historical analysis that really re-examines key events. We've got critical perspectives from thinkers analyzing power structures, foreign policy. And then there's this really unique material. Personal accounts from someone claiming, direct involvement in international economic activities designed, he says, to serve imperial interests.
Right. So our mission here is to really distill the most important insights from all these sources, explore the different facets because it's incredibly complex with some depth and analysis, and just see what stands out for you.
How do these sources maybe reframe history? How did the tools of influence change over time? And what does this perspective actually mean for understanding the world today?
It's about presenting the patterns the sources highlight, the arguments they make, and trying to do that impartially.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start where some sources suggest the deep roots of this pattern might lie, recontextualizing early American history. One thing that jumps out is this challenge to the old idea of North America as some, empty virgin land.
Yeah, there's a major point in modern scholarship presented here. It really pushes back hard on that narrative. It emphasizes that this continent was home to diverse, complex indigenous societies way before Europeans showed up.
With sophisticated structure.
Absolutely. Sophisticated political systems, huge trade networks, developed economies. These were established nations. The sources argue pretty strongly this wasn't empty space at all. It was occupied, managed land.
And reframing it that way changes how we view westward expansion, doesn't it? Some sources, like the one referencing Ned Blackhawk's perspective, see it differently.
They do. It wasn't just simple settlement in this view. It's analyzed as a prolonged, often violent form of imperialism against these existing nations. Understanding that piece, the sources argue, is pretty fundamental to grasping the origins of later American actions globally.
The sources get specific, too, about policies, like California after the gold rush.
Right, that's a stark example highlighted. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. It sounds protective, but the source describes it as effectively legalizing forced labor, even enslavement of native Californians.
Which contributed to population decline.
Massively, according to the sources. A catastrophic decline that, they argue, directly facilitated settler expansion by, clearing the way. It's presented as a very deliberate policy of subjugation.
And then you have these huge territorial acquisitions described more like conquest, the Mexican Cession, 1848.
Yeah, one source frames that not as some peaceful purchase, but as a direct result of military conquest of the Mexican-American War. It argues that war itself was largely driven by expansionist goals.
The land gained was just vast, wasn't it?
Immense. Present-day California, Nevada, Utah, chunks of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming. Over 500,000 square miles ceded in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
And the U.S. paid money, but the crucial point the sources make is...
The crucial point is that this wasn't empty land. The treaty brought large, existing Mexican and indigenous populations under U.S. rule. It directly challenges that narrative of just settling empty frontiers.
So the sources argue that this whole process, conquest, subjugation, it wasn't just about land. It actually shaped the definition of what it meant to be American back then.
Exactly. According to this perspective, that identity became tangled up with expansion, with defining who was in and who was other outside that identity. And this process, the sources suggest, kind of obscured the imperial nature of the country's origins.
And you see this pattern in the justifications, too.
Even back then, yeah. The sources describe how justifications framed in terms of benevolence, progress, or, a civilizing duty, often masked what were really economic and strategic interests. And they argue this pattern, using idealistic language for expansion, just carried right on into later overseas actions.
So why does looking back at this early history matter now, according to these sources?
Well, they argue it provides the foundational context. It helps understand that the exercise of power, the displacement of people, it was there from the start. In this view, it shapes how we might understand later foreign policy and power dynamics on a global scale.
Which transitions us nicely to what the sources call a shift. A shift to overseas power projection, late 19th, early 20th century. A different scale, a different nature, often called the new imperialism.
Absolutely. The sources lay out the driving forces pretty clearly. Economic expansion, the need for markets, resources, strategic thinking, especially naval power, influenced by people like Mahan, social Darwinism, applying those survival of the fittest ideas to nations, and that whole concept of the white man's burden, framing colonization almost as a duty.
And the methods changed, too.
They reflected the shift. Sources mentioned direct military intervention, outright annexation of overseas territories, gunboat diplomacy, using warships to back up demands, and dollar diplomacy, using financial leverage.
We see specific examples in the sources: the Spanish-American War outcomes, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam coming under U.S. control.
Right. The annexation of Hawaii, which some sources describe as basically a hostile takeover,
Sure.
the Philippine-American War, which was incredibly brutal, and things like the open door policy, trying to secure access to China.
And one specific policy change the sources highlight is the Roosevelt corollary. How did that change things?
It's presented as a really significant alteration of the Monroe Doctrine. It sort of flipped it from being defensive, keeping Europe out, to being offensive, justifying U.S. intervention within the Americas, asserting dominance, essentially.
And the sources say it was used to justify interventions where?
All over the Caribbean and Central America, according to the sources. Places like Cuba think the Platt Amendment giving the U.S. the right to intervene. Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, often involving U.S. Marines.
And the goals were?
Stabilizing governments, managing finances, protecting American economic and strategic interests. The sources argue it effectively established U.S. hegemony, dominance in that whole region.
And the Panama Canal fits into this picture too. Built around that time, 1870s to 1914.
Deeply intertwined with U.S. power projection, according to the sources. Its strategic importance is emphasized, and they mention the later conflicts over control involving figures like Omar Torrijos, who we'll definitely talk more about.
So this whole shift to overseas power, the sources argue, really set the stage for the 20th century.
Yeah, it massively expanded the scope of U.S. influence well beyond North America.
Yeah.
It laid the groundwork for this global role that critics, cited in the sources, often describe as imperial.
Okay, so that leads us into the next phase. Cold War hegemony and intervention. The sources frame the Cold War not just as a standoff, but as this overarching framework that shaped U.S. foreign policy.
Absolutely. And it solidified the U.S. role as a global superpower. The central concept driving things, as presented here, was containment, stopping the spread of communism.
And according to the sources, that became the justification for a lot of actions.
A very wide array of actions that, from the critical perspective in these sources, are seen as imperial. The argument is that geopolitical strategy, beating the Soviets, often trumped stated democratic ideals when it came down to it.
What were the tools used then?
Sources mention the big ones: formal alliances like NATO, the nuclear standoff itself, proxy wars fought indirectly, and numerous interventions, both overt military ones and covert operations by agencies like the CIA.
The sources give some pretty intense examples. Indonesia, 1965-66.
Yeah, that's presented as a really grim case study. After an alleged coup attempt, the U.S. is described as providing support money, equipment, even lists of suspected communists to the Indonesian military
For what purpose?
to carry out an anti-communist purge against the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. The scale of the violence cited in one source is just horrific. Estimates range from 500,000 to over 1 million people killed.
And the outcome.
The PKI was destroyed, Suharto's authoritarian regime took power, and Indonesia became a key U.S. ally in the region. We'll touch on John Perkins' later experiences there, which happened against this backdrop.
Chile, 1970-73 is another case the sources highlight.
Right. You had a democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, pursuing policies like nationalizing industries, including U.S.-owned copper mines.
And the U.S. response, according to the sources.
CIA covert operations to destabilize the government, economic pressure, driven by both anti-communism and protecting U.S. corporate interests. The sources are pretty clear on that dual motivation.
And the result there.
Allende was overthrown and killed in a military coup in 1973. General Pinochet took over, establishing a brutal dictatorship known for widespread human rights abuses.
So these Cold War examples, the sources argue, show a kind of continuity, framing interventions, but now under this anti-communist banner.
Exactly. The sources suggest this ideology provided a powerful cover. often leading to support for authoritarian regimes if they were seen as strategically useful against communism, even if they trampled democratic values themselves.
What's the key takeaway from these Cold War examples, according to the sources?
They're presented as really stark illustrations of how a dominant ideology can shape and justify foreign policy, sometimes with truly devastating consequences for the people in those countries. It shows the depth of power projection during that era.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now to something that feels, well, very contemporary, and it's detailed with incredible depth in some of these sources. Economic imperialism. This involves a concept and a type of actor that one source argues is central.
Right, this is where John Perkins' personal account laid out in one key source really takes center stage. He introduces this idea of economic hitmen, or EHMs.
And what are they, according to him?
He describes them as individuals whose main job, as he saw it, was to build empire, but primarily through economics, using debt and financial manipulation, not necessarily military force, at least not initially.
Okay, so drawing from his account, what was the EHM's core mission? How did it work?
The main function, as he describes it, was arranging these huge loans for developing countries. Loans often from institutions like the World Bank or directly from the U.S. government.
For infrastructure projects.
Yeah, big projects, power plants, highways, ports. But according to Perkins, these projects were structured primarily to benefit large U.S. corporations who would get the fat contracts to build everything. And crucially, he mentions using deliberately inflated economic forecasts to make these massive loans seem justifiable.
Suggesting the numbers were cooked.
That's his claim, a deliberate manipulation to saddle countries with debt.
Which leads to what he calls the debt trap.
Exactly. He argues these loans were often intentionally designed to be too large for the countries to realistically repay. That creates financial dependency. If a country couldn't make its payments, defaulted.
Then what happens?
Then, according to the sources detailing Perkins' account, the U.S. government, or the big international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, which he sees as working hand in glove with what he calls the corporatocracy, would step in.
And demand concessions.
Right. They demand harsh austerity measures, cutting social programs, forcing the privatization of state-owned industries and utilities, demanding access and control over natural resources like oil or minerals, basically ensuring compliance through economic leverage. Debt as a weapon.
Debt as a tool of control. Okay, but what if the EHMs couldn't trap a country that way? The sources mention jackals.
Yeah, that's the term Perkins uses for the next level, the backup plan. If the economic pressure didn't work, if a leader resisted, the jackals were brought in.
And who are they?
He describes them as covert operatives. Their job, according to him, was to use threats, bribery, blackmail, or, if necessary, overthrow or even assassinate leaders who wouldn't play ball, to install someone who would be compliant. He presents it as the violent enforcement arm when the economic manipulation failed.
He uses that term corporatocracy. How does he define that?
He defines it as this powerful, intertwined network. Major corporations, Wall Street financiers, key figures in government, the EHMs doing the economic work, and the jackals providing the muscle, all working together in his view.
For what goal?
To create and maintain a global empire. An empire based, he says, on debt, resource extraction, military power, often used to protect economic interests, and promoting a culture of materialism.
Perkins also talks about his own path in the system, recruitment.
Yeah, she mentions alleged connections to the NSA through someone named Einar Grieve, who supposedly recruited him. He talks about his early work as an EHM in places like Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Panama, Ecuador, Colombia, applying these economic strategies.
Did he develop doubts?
Significant ones. He describes this growing, crushing sense of guilt over the impact of his work. He even uses the word slaver to describe his role, realizing, he says, how these deals impoverish local populations and damaged environments while enriching corporations and compliant elites.
Which led him to quit.
Yes, he resigned in 1980. And much later, he decided to write about his experiences, becoming an activist critical of the very system he was once part of.
And he explicitly links major institutions to this. The U.S. Treasury, World Bank, IMF.
Absolutely. He describes their involvement as integral, facilitating the loans, enforcing the conditions when countries defaulted. He sees them as key players in the debt dependency cycle he describes.
So taking this EHM perspective from the sources, it really changes how you might look at things like international aid or development projects, doesn't it?
It certainly introduces a critical lens. It suggests that these activities, even when presented as benevolent aid, could, according to this view, simultaneously serve powerful corporate or strategic interests rather than purely benefiting the recipient nation. It adds a significant layer of complexity to the analysis.
Okay, let's get into some of the specific case studies from the sources. These really bring the concepts of economic and covert action to life, drawing heavily on Perkins' accounts and other critical analyses. They add a lot of depth.
Indonesia comes up again, but this time from Perkins's direct experience. He talks about being there, creating those inflated economic forecasts he mentioned.
To justify projects.
Exactly. And arguing that the infrastructure built power grids, roads was primarily designed to serve corporate needs, especially oil and mining companies like Newmont. He describes feeling intense guilt, knowing his work contributed to things like sweatshops and environmental destruction, all under the Suharto regime we discussed earlier.
Saudi Arabia is interesting because, as the sources note, they were oil rich. They didn't need loans in the same way.
Right, so the strategy described there was different. Not debt, but recycling petrodollars. After the U.S. went off the gold standard in '71, the deal described was basically the U.S. guaranteed Saudi security, and the Saudis agreed to invest their oil profits back into U.S. Treasury bonds and U.S. companies, and crucially, price oil only in U.S. dollars.
Creating dependency through investment in military ties, not debt.
Exactly. Establishing an oil standard that propped up the dollar. The sources also touch on the Saudi royal family's internal issues, corruption, vulnerabilities. Perkins mentions his interactions with U.S. officials involved there. One source even points to alleged intelligence intercepts, suggesting links between some royals and funding for extremist groups, referencing a post-9/11 Vanity Fair report.
Then there's Iran under the Shah, contrasted with Saudi Arabia, also oil-rich.
But a different history, different population. The strategy there, according to Perkins, was to build up the Shah as this modernizing figure, a symbol of progress closely allied with Washington and Western business. The sources mention U.S. involvement in putting the Shah in power earlier, and also note his regime's later poor human rights record.
What really stands out in the sources, though, are the stories of leaders who apparently push back against this system. Omar Torrijos in Panama.
He's presented as a key example of defiance. He kicked out the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which Perkins describes as a front for resource exploitation, and crucially, Torrijos refused to renegotiate the Panama Canal Treaty on terms favorable to the incoming Reagan administration. He wanted genuine Panamanian control.
And then he died in a plane crash, July 31st, 1981.
Yes. And the sources, especially Perkins' account, detail the widespread suspicion immediately afterward, particularly in Latin America, that it was a CIA assassination. Perkins mentioned seeing CIA assassination, headlines everywhere.
Does he name specific enemies Torrijos had?
He does. He points to powerful multinational corporations, but singles out the Bechtel Group. He mentions that senior Bechtel figures like George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, who were moving into top Reagan administration posts, apparently despised Torrijos. Why? Because Torrijos was exploring the possibility of having Japan build a new sea-level canal, which would have cut Bechtel out of a potentially massive contract. Perkins is very clear. He believes Torrijos' death was no accident. He implies it was the jackals.
Another figure Perkins focuses on is Jaime Roldos in Ecuador.
Another critical example for Perkins. Roldos was a democratically elected president who, Perkins says, also defied the EHMs. He wanted to use Ecuador's oil wealth to help the country's poor, not just serve foreign corporations.
And he also died in a plane crash just a few months before Torrijos, May 24, 1981.
Yes, and again, Perkins recounts the immediate allegations of CIA involvement from various sources. He shares a personal connection, having met Roldos, and states his firm belief that it was an assassination, noting the suspicious timing coming so soon after Roldos challenged the oil companies and just before Torrijos' death.
Perkins contrasts Roldos with later Ecuadorian leaders like Lucio Gutierrez, who he says caved to the IMF and World Bank, leading to popular protests and his eventual ouster.
But then he really highlights Rafael Correa as a major example of successful resistance in Ecuador.
What did Correa do, according to the sources?
He took several defiant steps. He closed the largest U.S. military base in Latin America, located in Ecuador. He renegotiated oil contracts to ensure a much larger share of the revenue went to the Ecuadorian people, funding significant investments in healthcare, education, and poverty reduction under his Buen Vivir, or good living philosophy.
The sources mention some specific achievements under Correa.
Yeah, they point to things like winning a massive $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron for environmental damage caused by Texaco in the Amazon. Ecuador adopted a new constitution, described as the first in the world to grant rights to nature itself. And poverty rates dropped significantly during his tenure.
Perkins also mentions a specific incident with an oil auction.
Right. In 2013, Ecuador tried to auction off oil blocks in the Amazon, but most major oil companies stayed away. Perkins attributes this to bad publicity generated by indigenous groups and international activists, arguing it showed a shift that corporate exploitation could be made too costly reputationally. He saw it as proof that consciousness was changing and that marginalized people uniting could actually challenge the corporatocracy.
Okay, stepping back a bit, Chile under Pinochet gets mentioned again.
Just to reiterate the point made in the sources, his dictatorship followed the U.S.-backed coup against Allende, linking that earlier intervention, described as protecting economic interests, to decades of repression.
Nicaragua in the 80s.
Described in one source as basically state-sponsored terrorism, the Contra War funded and directed by the U.S. to overthrow the Sandinista government, which was defying Washington. The source mentions the World Court ruling against the U.S. for its actions.
And Iraq is complex in these sources.
Very. Perkins mentions having inside info through his work. One source notes that the U.S. actually supported Saddam Hussein at various points when it suited strategic interests. It also argues the U.S. deliberately allowed Saddam to brutally crush uprisings in 1991 because they preferred a known dictator, an iron fist, to the uncertainty of Iraqis actually taking charge.
Then the sanctions and the 2003 invasion?
The sources discuss the devastating impact of the sanctions. The 2003 invasion is analyzed critically. One source notes it inadvertently helped Hugo Chavez by sending oil prices soaring. Another offers a scathing critique, talking about millions of refugees, the destruction of the country, fueling sectarian conflict, all under the banner of liberation. This source even argues the U.S. suffered a major geopolitical defeat, ultimately leaving Iraq more under Iranian influence.
The sources also touch on other, more personal methods of control, blackmail.
Briefly, yeah. Perkins mentions it as a tool sometimes used against leaders exploiting personal weaknesses or compromises, citing figures like Manuel Noriega or suggesting leaders might be lured with women, booze, and drugs to create leverage and ensure they stayed in line.
Wow. These specific examples, drawing from Perkins and other critical sources, really add texture, don't they? They move beyond the abstract theory.
They absolutely do. They aim to show the human cost, the complex interplay of economics, covert action, political outcomes, the real-world consequences, according to these perspectives, of the geopolitical strategies and economic policies being described. They provide that depth and analysis.
Okay, part 6 shifts focus slightly, looking at ideological control alongside critiques and resistance discussed in the sources. There's this idea presented that, especially in societies where public opinion matters, elites need to shape that opinion.
Right. The sources bring up concepts like the manufacture of consent, famously associated with Walter Lippmann, and the engineering of consent, linked to Edward Bernays. Yeah. These are described as techniques for managing public opinion when you can't just use force. And one source suggests this attitude was pretty widespread among intellectuals, regardless of their political leaning.
And part of this is defining who the enemies are.
Definitely. The sources describe how certain figures or countries get systematically designated as villains painted as monsters, proxies of the evil empire, even a mad dog, as Reagan apparently called Gaddafi.
Libya is used as an example.
Yeah. Labeled a top state sponsor of terrorism by the U.S. The sources analyzed the U.S. justification for bombing Libya in '86, claiming self-defense or preempting attacks, but they contrast this with the general international view at the time, which, according to one source, largely dismissed the U.S. justification as lacking credible evidence under international law.
Iran is another case study in framing.
Yes. Framed by some in the U.S. as the absolute gravest threat to world peace. The sources juxtapose this rhetoric with what they present as U.S. intelligence assessments from the time, which reportedly describe Iran's military spending as relatively low, its strategic doctrine as defensive, and, crucially, found no hard evidence Iran was actively building nuclear weapons, seeing its nuclear program more as a deterrent strategy.
So why the disconnect, according to the sources?
They suggest this intense focus on Iran serves other purposes. It distracts, they argue, from potentially more immediate dangers, like nuclear materials in Pakistan falling into extremist hands. And it helps justify policies aimed at protecting U.S. allies in the region and maintaining overall control.
The sources also really dig into how terms like terrorism and retaliation are used differently depending on who's doing the acting.
This is a major point of analysis in one source. It provides detailed examples. Actions against the U.S. or Israel, like the Achille Lauro hijacking or the Malad school massacre, are unequivocally labeled terrorism in U.S. discourse.
But actions by the U.S. or its allies?
Often framed very differently, according to the source. Take the Israeli bombing of the PLO headquarters in Tunis. condemned by the UN Security Council, called armed aggression or even state terrorism by some members. But the U.S. often portrayed such actions, or Israeli bombings in Lebanon that killed civilians, sometimes using U.S.-supplied helicopters, as legitimate retaliation or necessary security measures. Not terrorism, by definition.
And the U.S. generally supported Israel's actions, the sources note.
Yes. And based on this perceived double standard in applying the term terrorism, one source draws a provocative conclusion that if you apply the definition consistently based on actions causing terror among civilian populations for political ends, then the U.S. itself, during certain periods, could be considered a leading state sponsor of terrorism through its own actions and its support for allies' actions. It's presented as an analytical point based on definitions.
Various specific U.S. military actions also get scrutinized. The Obama raid that killed bin Laden.
One source analyzes it critically, describing bin Laden as an unarmed target who was killed, not captured, his body disposed of at sea, denying a trial. This is contrasted with Abraham Lincoln's view that assassination violated international norms. The source also discusses the CIA's approach to torture, arguing it focused on psychological methods precisely because they were harder to prosecute under the UN Convention, and examines how different administrations interpreted that convention. Abu Ghraib is mentioned in this context.
The U.S. invasion of Panama comes up again.
Yeah, revisited to highlight the human cost hundreds or thousands killed. According to the source, the U.S. vetoing UN resolutions condemning the invasion and the act of kidnapping Noriega. The source frames his U.S. trial and imprisonment for crimes, allegedly committed mostly while on the CIA payroll, as itself violating international norms.
And the 2011 intervention in Libya,
also critiqued sharply in one source. It argues the NATO intervention, led by the U.S., U.K., and France, went beyond the UN Security Council mandate, which was ostensibly about protecting civilians, significantly increased the death toll compared to before the intervention, ultimately destabilized the country, left it in ruins, inadvertently created a base for ISIS, and ignored potential diplomatic solutions proposed by the African Union, which, the source claims, Gaddafi had agreed to in principle.
The sources also look inward, historically, at violence against the U.S. labor movement.
Yes, detailing how state power and private security forces were used to crush worker organizing. They connect this to efforts by elites to instill what Adam Smith critically called the vile maxim, the principle of all for ourselves and nothing for other people. The sources argue that popular movements challenging concentrated power were often defeated primarily by force, alongside sophisticated propaganda and strike-breaking tactics.
And they argue corporations still rely heavily on state power today.
Very much so. Citing things like modern investor rights agreements, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, often negotiated in secret, as examples of how state power is used to lock in rules that primarily benefit multinational corporations, sometimes at the expense of public interest or national sovereignty.
What's the potential consequence of all these critiques and alternative narratives becoming more widespread?
The sources suggest it leads to an erosion of American soft power, the ability to persuade and attract rather than coerce. If perceptions of hypocrisy, double standards, or pure self-interest persist globally, fueled by these critical analyses and alternative information sources, it becomes much harder for the U.S. to build alliances, justify actions, and maintain its influence through legitimacy.
So this whole section on ideological control and critique really underscores something for you, the listener, doesn't it? According to these sources, understanding how narratives get constructed, how terms get defined by power, is crucial for critically evaluating information yourself.
Exactly. Examining these critiques provides alternative viewpoints that challenge the dominant narratives and hopefully encourage a deeper, more nuanced analysis of global events and power dynamics. It pushes you to ask, whose interests are being served here?
Which brings us to our final part, Part 7, Seeking Alternatives and the Future. Because despite the powerful systems described, the sources don't just leave it there. They also talk about resistance and paths forward.
Yeah, there's definitely a thread of agency and hope presented. Latin America, for instance, is highlighted as a region where significant resistance to U.S. dominance emerged, particularly in the early 2000s.
Figures like Chavez, Lula, Morales.
Exactly. They're mentioned as leaders who, according to the sources, showed it was possible for countries to carve out more independent paths to slip out from under the U.S. yoke, at least for a time, by prioritizing national interests and regional integration over alignment with Washington's agenda.
And John Perkins's own journey after leaving the EHM world is framed as seeking alternatives, too.
Yes, his shift towards nonprofit work, his engagement with indigenous cultures, supporting groups like the Pachamama Alliance. It's presented as his way of trying to undo some of the damage he feels he contributed to.
What motivates him, according to his account?
He says it's about inspiring people to change the world, to move away from the death economy. His term for the system based on exploitation, debt, and war towards what he calls a new dream.
A new dream based on.
Environmental sustainability, social justice, and genuine personal fulfillment, rather than just material consumption. He talks about seeing shifts in people's aspirations, moving away from the old model.
Does he suggest practical steps for individuals?
One source outlines some of his suggestions, things like living more consciously, focusing on relationships, connecting with nature, reducing consumption, avoiding fossil fuels. Also, picking a cause you believe in and actively supporting organizations working for systemic change, and encouraging entrepreneurs to pursue passion and dare to be different, not just follow the old corporate path.
Ecuador under Correa gets revisited here as a kind of positive example.
As a tangible case, yes, of a country trying to implement some of these alternative ideas, according to the sources. The success in the Chevron case, the rights of nature in the Constitution. These are presented as concrete outcomes of resisting the corporatocracy and prioritizing different values. That failed oil auction is seen as proof that change is possible when people organize and challenge corporate power directly.
But the sources also acknowledge that the whole idea of American imperialism continuing is still up for debate.
Oh, absolutely. It's presented as highly contested territory. Actions taken by the U.S. will continue to be framed by supporters as necessary global leadership, promoting stability and democracy. Critics, like those cited extensively here, will continue to frame those same actions as self-serving hegemony, aimed at maintaining economic and military dominance.
And that ongoing ideological battle, the sources suggest, will shape the future.
Pretty much. That fundamental disagreement over the nature and purpose of U.S. power is seen as central to defining future foreign policy and international relations.
So, drawing all this together, what does it suggest for you, the listener? How can this knowledge be used? According to these sources, it seems to suggest that change, even against powerful systems, isn't impossible.
Right. It highlights the potential power of collective action, shifts in consciousness, individual choices. It suggests there are alternative ways to think about economies, about international relations, focusing on different values than the ones Perkins and others critique.
Well, we have certainly covered a lot of ground today. A real deep dive into sources presenting a critical view of American power from its historical roots, right through economic tools, covert actions, how ideas are shaped, and examples of resistance.
It's definitely a complex picture, isn't it? And these sources really push for looking beyond simple narratives, getting into the specific details, the critiques, the human costs involved in the systems they describe. It really urges a deeper level of analysis.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, something drawn from these themes. Adam Smith warned against what he called the vile maxim, the idea of all for ourselves and nothing for other people, that he saw the powerful trying to impose. This stands in pretty stark contrast to the ideas of solidarity, mutual aid, that new dream championed by critics and resistance movements. So considering what one source describes as an ongoing, bitter, and incessant class war waged by elites, perhaps the question is, what's your own role in navigating this landscape? How do we foster a future that maybe prioritizes something beyond just self-interest and materialism?
That's a powerful question. It really prompts thinking about the systems we live in, the values we choose, and ultimately the kind of world we want to help create.
Keep asking questions. Keep thinking critically. That's what the deep dive is all about.